So, you contact me on this is Noah Fredericks, I believe is your name. Um,
Yeah, yeah.
you contact me on Twitter. You're saying you wanted to debate on public property and collective ownership. Do you want to sort
Mm,
of elaborate on that at all?
yeah. So essentially, I read through your course and things like that. Just like reviewing your positions on Twitter, I just don't see essentially how the positions that you make regarding collective property and public property and open borders can exist within a libertarian framework. I don't understand the fundamental principles that are leading you to that. Uh, starting with collective ownership.
Sure. So,
Um,
sorry.
I
Do you want
guess, yeah, go ahead.
to?
Sorry, I was just going to ask what your, I guess, principal argument is for why collective ownership can't exist.
Sure. So the idea is that property rights are conflict avoiding norms. It's because we have this issue of scarcity, which leads to the fact that Crusoe and Friday can try and use the same thing in different ways at the same time. That's called a conflict, mutually exclusive actions. That's where we get property rights from. The property right says, okay, Crusoe is the owner; he has the right to control it, and therefore Friday is the aggressor, right? He's not allowed to use it. Um, so when this comes into play with group property is we can assume, for the sake of argument, that a set of people, A through Z, all commonly own a stick. Now, how do we resolve conflicts within that set? So imagine A wants to use a stick to spearfish, and B doesn't want this to happen. So it's either going to be the case that our legal theory says spearfishing should happen, or it shouldn't happen. If our legal theory is saying that the spearfishing should happen, that means that it's saying that A is the owner and B isn't. But that would contradict the presumption that B does indeed own it, because we assumed everybody owns it, right? And vice versa. For if we say that the spearfishing shouldn't happen, that means that A doesn't own it and B does, but that would contradict the presumption that A does own it. So that's the idea. Whichever option we pick, if we assume group ownership, we're leading to a contradiction. So our initial assumption of group ownership must be wrong.
Yeah, I just don't like if that is the case, and that's like the conclusion that you draw, that essentially, I guess you could say ownership is a sovereign right. It's not just a legal right. Then the concept of contracts and trade in general wouldn't be able to coexist with that ideology. I mean, a contract is, by definition, you subordinating your sovereignty to essentially a piece of paper in the legal sense, so that you essentially terminate your status as a principal sovereign individual owner. And the existence of contracts, like I'm not saying that within within purely the context of homesteading, you can have collective ownership. But the idea that in a society, it is within the libertarian ideology impossible to have collective ownership while contracts exist and while they are a principal component of libertarianism, that's not something that it's not a very logical claim.
So, I mean, contracts don't really bear on this. The way that we come to contracts here, at least the way I ground it in first principles, is you're allowed to, if it's an alienable good, right, something like a stick or whatever, then what happens with a contract is that is a title of transfer of title from person A to person B. So person A is abandoning the stick at the same time that person B is taking up control of it. That I don't see how that would contradict at all with my proof against group ownership.
Well, contracts, I mean, even in your I guess your course, they have conditions, and those conditions aren't immediately effective. So if you can possibly have a system where a contract exists over a certain period of time, and while the contract is in effect, essentially from the moment that a contract is signed by an owner of property until the period of time where the contract essentially expires, there is not one the sovereign owner over the property anymore. The conditions of ownership are determined by that contract. And that's essentially where the concept of collective ownership comes from. I mean, joint ownership between, two, a married couple over a house is always done through a contract. It's not that this is something that is homesteaded. One individual creates the house and then it magically disperses its rights between two different people. It's something that is agreed upon in a way that essentially mediates those contradictions and those conflicts that can erupt. Like if you have some form of contract over, say, even a company, that's going to dictate how contracts are resolved, how decisions are made. And it doesn't have to be that it comes from one source. You could have a system where through contract, say agreements are, disputed, or disputed agreements are, the conclusion is the result of a democratic process with some sort of tiebreaker system. I mean, that's a way that you can have it so that there isn't this contradiction of conflicts, because again, unless the principled, primary assumption of ownership is that it's a sovereign right of an individual, then, which it clearly isn't if you have a contract where you defer to that, then, you can have and allow for collective ownership just within the concept of a contract in general.
So this seems like a misreading of the theory of contracts. I'm going on the title transfer theory of contracts. So that means that all a contract is doing is it's specifying the terms of a transfer of title from some person to another person. Nowhere do you require in that, even if you have an aleatory contract where it's got future bearing conditions, you don't require any sort of, and then in the middle they both own it. That doesn't make sense. Like, let's take the example of a loan, where I loan you $100 now in exchange for $110 a year from now, right? If the question would be, okay, well, who owns that $100 immediately after I've given it to you? The answer is you own it, right? You own that $100 and you can do with it whatever you want. You could burn it up if you wanted to, right in front of me. And then if a year comes and you don't actually have $110, then the loan just goes bad, right? I just have to suck it up because you don't have $110 to transfer to me at that time, right? This is Kinsell's understanding of aleatory contracts. There's an implicit clause in there of unless it's impossible, right? Now, if you do have $110 a year from now, the investment went well or whatever, then in that moment, it immediately transfers over to me. At no point in this time scale do we both own $110. And by going bad on the loan, you also haven't stolen anything from me. That doesn't make any sense, which is why debtor's prison is invalid.
But the issue is that regardless of that situation, the terms of the loan are the determining factor of ownership. It's not necessarily the ability of one, like as you said, with the exception of impossibility, it's not determined. The ownership isn't determined by a sovereign the second that you create a contract. Essentially, is the idea. And then if that is the case, and ownership is determined by this highest authority, which is the contract, within plausible, grounds, then that can distribute that ownership among a collective of people.
Okay, so you seem to be making a bit of a mistake here, which is to say that the contract doesn't define ownership. Contracts don't define property rights, because contracts are contracts about property rights. What all a contract defines is a set of transfers of title to property. So this assumes that there's already such a thing as property, and that we've already got a theory of property, right? If you can't have contract theory and then property theory, which seems like the step you're trying to make, where we can just have whatever arbitrary property theory we want, so long as we have the contracts in place. Which, no, that's a stolen concept fallacy, because contracts are contracts about property.
Well, not necessarily. That's not necessary that contracts. I'm asserting that contracts come before property. I'm saying that concepts or property is something that is fundamental, and that ownership is a construct that defines essentially who in the social context has a right to property. It's not a matter of objective reality. It's a matter of social agreement. It's something that people can recognize as legitimacy. And in the context of a contract, where there's a contract present over property, that is what society or legality or legitimacy is determining as the rightful train of succession of this property. If it's the case that, a contract can determine conditionally who owns property at a later date, then within those conditions, you can adhere to certain rules. You can say that essentially, this company, this, organization that holds this property is going to be managed by a CEO, and under the condition that they adhere to certain underlying and written principles within the contract, they have exclusive control. But then if they break that control, or if they break that contract, or for some other reason, the investors who actually own in regards to the resources of the company, they can decide to replace that individual based on the terms of the contract that the CEO and the owners have decided upon. And that's what society is going to defer to, regardless of, some individual claim of sovereignty over the property, because that is not something, even the non-aggression principle itself is not deferred to the sovereignty of a property owner. Like within the libertarian context, we have, ideas of proportionality. You can't just from a, I guess for an example, an absurd example, if someone steps on someone's undefined property grounds, and the owner of that property decides to just shoot the person on site, that person would, be seen in society through the non-aggression principle as being an aggressor themselves. So that's not an example where you are truly a sovereign over your property, and that's not what defines ownership, your sovereignty. It's what is essentially accepted as the non-aggression principle and voluntary action, which can be used to organize society or property in any way you see fit.
All right, so you said there that property theory is a matter of social agreement. I just want to sort of interrogate that position there. So if Crusoe and Friday said that Jury belongs to them, and they may fuck him up the ass all they want, whether he likes it or not, would that be fine because they have socially agreed to it?
No, I mean, if you're talking about property from, not property, but
they did socially agree to it,
what
right?
we defer to. Here's the thing. What we're talking about right now is the libertarian definition of property. And because of that, we have principles. We don't actually defer to an individual sovereign. We defer to principles of the non-aggression principle, of voluntary association, of contract theory, of property rights and ownership ideas.
What is the status of the non-aggression principle? Because you said we're not appealing to objective principles in reality or anything like that. And you said we are talking about social agreement. So is the NEP just socially agreed to?
No, what I'm saying is that that's an idea that libertarians are socially agreeing upon. So if we are deferring or constructing our concept of property just by nature, that's going to be an agreed upon system that we are subordinating to our ideals that form that construct of property. It's not something that is just objective in the sense of like, oh yeah, we have this idea of property and it's just there, and we essentially just purely observe it. We have ideas on how it works, and that's what this discussion is. It's not an objective statement that property is essentially a sovereign right. That's deferred to the ideas, or us saying that is deferred to the ideas that led us to that conclusion. And that's what I'm saying. Like contract theory, property, contract theory, the idea of title transfer, the idea of the non-aggression principle are things that we all defer to. They are the principles that lead us to essentially an idea of property and self-ownership. So if you are a self-owner, that does not necessarily mean that essentially anything you do is justified or fits within a libertarian purview. If I murder someone, that is, conceptually, I'm not infringing upon my own ownership. I'm exercising my ownership, but we consider that to be wrong because of the non-aggression principle, which we defer to. And in the same way, when you have a system of property, you're going to defer to contracts on that property because it's an expression of a essentially more fundamental principle, which is the idea of voluntary agreements and essentially the consent of the owner. If I create a contract on property that I previously have owned or that I own, the second I sign that contract, I'm essentially, again, with your stated idea that contracts are just a form of title transfer, I am deferring my sovereignty and my exclusive right to that property to the terms of the contract by signing it. And that's where you get the idea that property can be transferred. And if it can be transferred to one individual, then by the same nature, you can transfer it to many through, and it's just, I guess, not necessarily, it doesn't have to necessarily be divisible for you to do that. It's just a matter of the contract in that situation. While there is a contract in effect over property, it is the sovereignty of the individuals who own it is deferred to the contract. And whatever terms that sets, whether it can be or can't be owned by multiple people, is something that's dictated by the contract and not by just a matter of fact exercise of individual sovereignty.
Okay, so I think I get your stance there. You're saying ownership norms, property norms, they're deferring to the NEP, and property norms are also deferring to contracts, right? And then,
yes.
So then if there's a contract which says that you can have group ownership, then you can have it. Is that your stance?
Yes, essentially.
Okay, you're confused about the hierarchy of libertarian legal theory here. So the non-aggression principle is at the very, very root. Now, this is an innovation that I came up with, so you're not going to read this in other books or anything. The non-aggression principle is at the very root. It's the ground level. There's nothing below it. Well, there's stuff below it, but as far as legal theory is concerned, that's the root.
In terms of society, yeah.
And then the non-aggression principle, from that's all you need. It implies property theory, and property theory implies contract theory. So it's not that contract theory is below property theory, which is what you're saying when it defers to contracts in the same way that it defers the NEP. Like, first of all, there's no deferring, right? There isn't a contradiction between property theory and the non-aggression principle, because property theory is implied by the non-aggression principle. In the same way, contract theory comes after property theory, because contracts are contracts about property. You can't have the concept of a contract if you don't have the concept of property in the first place. So your idea of we can just have whatever contracts we want and imply whatever property theory we want, even one with a group property, it doesn't fly. That doesn't work. It's a stolen concept fallacy.
Well, what you're saying is you're discussing property, not ownership. And what I'm saying is that
what does
ownership as a concept.
What's the difference between ownership and property?
Ownership is the socially recognized right to property. And what I'm saying, my whole point is that ownership as a concept, it falls, or contract and property are both they are both things that determine ownership. Property and contracts may be different with respect to each other. You may say that contracts are derived from property, but as a society, or I guess not as a society, but as a construct, ownership relates to both of them. And in the context of ownership, we defer to contracts above the mere individual sovereignty of individual, or the individual sovereignty over, let's say, a homesteader. If a homesteader were to, I don't know, create a house, and that sovereignty in the context of ownership was our exclusive and or primary determining factor of ownership, then if they gave away the house, which they have the sovereign right to do with a contract, if the sovereignty of the individual is the overriding construct in ownership, then they would be able to reclaim that house from the person that they presumably signed a contract transferring the title to it. If again, the only way that you can break that concept, the idea of, I guess, like property would not be transferable if we had to defer to, the rightful owner as whoever homesteaded it and had a concept of individual sovereignty that could not defer to another higher organizational or like social system, which is what contracts are.
Just real quick, that you have the right to control something does not imply that you will always from then on out have the right to control it. You can abandon things as long as it's not your body, right? You can abandon alienable goods. That's all well and good. So it's you're fully capable of having contracts on that basis. But so just to be clear, when I'm saying property theory, I'm talking about the correct ownership norms, like what the correct ownership norms are. So that implies contract theory, not the other way around. So, because a contract is a transfer of title to property, which is what ownership means. Ownership is title to property, right, from A to B. So you need the concept of a title to property, i.e. you need the concept of ownership before you have the concept of a contract. You can't mix these up. Just in the same way it makes no sense to say that property is theft, because theft means that you're taking someone else's property, right? It makes no sense to say property is theft, because it's a stolen concept. It's taking what you don't have a genetic right to, right? So you're still trying to put contract theory as being more fundamental than property theory, but you can't do that, right? So you can't have a contract which says, and therefore we're going to have fractional reserve banking, right? It doesn't make any sense. You can't have that contract. You can't have a contract which says, and then I transfer this to this group of people, because there's still a contradiction in there. That contract doesn't make sense, right? You can't transfer that title to those people because you can't have a group title to property.
No, like, that's not what I'm claiming. Like, essentially, I guess to make it into a parallel or to make it into an analogy, what I'm saying is that your concept of ownership within the context of property, you're essentially defining, what would you say? You're defining, contracts as something that is built off of the foundation of property. But in the same way that, self-ownership, based on the principle of self-ownership, you lose, or based on the principle of self-ownership, you would argue that someone has essentially over their body, they have complete sovereignty over their actions. Say if one person was on an island rather than, Crusoe and Faraday, it was just one person, they would have complete sovereignty over any action that they take. But the second that you introduce a society into the system, you have to create the non-aggression principle, which is in the same way that you said that the non-aggression principle is fundamental, and it's derived from, essentially, it is derived from the concept of ownership and the sovereign right of owners
No,
over their bodies.
I would disagree on that front. The non-aggression principle comes
Okay.
first, and then you have that you can't initiate conflicts with other people's bodies, which is where we get the idea of self-ownership from.
But what I'm saying is essentially that the idea of the non-aggression principle requires a subject to be aggressed upon. Fundamentally, the base assumption in a libertarian worldview is that absent external society, we can do whatever we want. We are essentially sovereign in both ourselves and our property. And our property is, by definition, anything that we essentially use or choose to use or want to use. The second you introduce society, you have to subordinate that sovereignty with things like the non-aggression principle. And because you're subordinating that sovereignty over yourself, your claim that essentially ownership is tantamount to an individual sovereignty over property goes out the window. It's no longer that you are sovereign over this property and therefore anyone else who controls it by definition negates your ownership. Like, that's not the case once you introduce society. Once that is possible and you can essentially negate people's sovereignty in a justified way, then you can introduce the idea of collective or joint property ownership. And my essentially argument is that contracts are a form of that, because that is one of these institutions that subordinates your sovereignty over the property. That is essentially a social hierarchy that's created where your ownership is deferred, or your sovereignty rather is deferred. Your ownership is still existing, but your sovereignty is deferred to the contract as it relates to your ownership. So that is what lays the ground and eliminates the contradictions of collective ownership.
Well, it's just, if we're, on this topic of collective ownership, let's just cut to the real meat and potatoes of this. How do you resolve that contradiction? So A wants to spearfish, B doesn't want this to happen. Does it happen or not?
Well, essentially, if you have a contract that decides, well, it's a Tuesday, so it's spearfishing day, so it can be used to spearfish, then my point still stands that if you have a structure in place within a contract to settle disagreements and conflicts, which is essentially, should be one of the primary functions of a contract, to be, to avoid disputes, or even you can argue that, say a contract is created that forces people to come to an agreement. Otherwise, the property is essentially dispersed and the contract is made null and void, and essentially the title transfer is placed into full effect, or it is completely reversed. Then it's not contradictory that there is an initial agreement in the sovereign decisions of the people owning it.
So to be clear,
you can come up with some sort of contractual structure that makes that not contradictory by saying that multiple inputs are required in order to make decisions on property. You still have, in that situation, you would still have control over the property. You still have an exclusive control over the property, unless you have an instance of public property, which is complete nonsense, but you still have the structure of ownership, which is an exclusive right to control and use property. It's exclusive. It's not a sovereign right. It's an exclusive right. You still have more control and more influence over that property than other people, but that does not mean that you necessarily can't essentially not get your way.
So to be clear here, this isn't like some elaborate contract structure where all these different people have agreed to all these different contracts, where it's like, okay, the second anybody doesn't want to spearfish on spearfishing day, it transfers to the guy who does want to spearfish the most, or whatever it would be, right?
Well, I'm saying it doesn't have to transfer in general. That's my point.
It's that both of them own it, right? They don't have these crazy contracts going on where it's transferring between them. It's just A and A through Z all own this stick. This is all the information we have. That they just decided one day, You know, they came and they decided, you know what, let's all own this stick, shake hands on it, yep. A says, I'm going to go spearfish with it. B says, no, don't do that. How do you resolve that conflict?
Well, your assumption is that essentially, my point is that to do that, you would need a contract. Because absent a contract, the assumption is that that property is formed through homesteading. You can't have two people essentially homestead one resource at the same exact time. Like, the concept of homesteading is an individualistic idea. So for essentially to transfer that idea into a collective form of ownership, you would necessarily need to create a contract that stipulates these conditions of, I guess, the conditions of the ownership.
So contracts define terms of transfer of title to property. Who is it transferring title of property from, and who is it transferring it to? Like, what would this contract look like?
Well, you could say, I don't know, let's say the stick was worth let's say it was worth $10, or the market price of the stick was $10, and person B came up to A and said, here's $5, and in return, we will share the stick. In that, I guess in that process, you could create essentially a contract that says, while there is agreement on the use of the stick, or while there is agreement and people are, I guess, deferring to this system of dispute settlement within the contract, then A gets to keep the $5 and B gets to use the stick. And if that becomes an irreparable conflict, then essentially either, I guess it would just be that B gets the $5 back. And that's the process that you would have, whereas a title transfer, but in the duration where the title is not transferred, or I guess you could say in between the stages of title transfer, there is a period of conditional agreement that has to be followed in order for the latter to take place. And that's what would essentially, enable the collective ownership.
Okay, so all you've described there isn't a system of group property. It's a system of, I see two contracts in that. The first contract is B transfers to A title to $5. And then there's a second aleatory contract in there, which is that if there's ever disagreement over how to use the stick in the future, then A transfers to B $5, right? That isn't group property. That's just B giving A $5. And then if they disagree, then A agrees to give B $5, right? But A still owns the stick the whole time. The stick hasn't changed owner at all. A has owned that stick the entire time. It was never the case that A and B own the stick.
But ownership is defined as an exclusive right to control property. And that control is allowed, that essentially the ability to control and the ability to, let's say, just use in general the stick by the contract of setting conditional agreements upon property that A has possession of and say B rightfully owns, you're able to essentially create a system where B and A both have an economic stake in agreement over the property, or they have a conditional control over the property, and therefore they do have exclusive rights over that property. The property may not be, the rights may not be as explicit for B, but in the same sense, A still has to follow a certain conditions over the property.
No, he doesn't. He can do whatever the hell he wants with the property. And then if he's got $5, then he has to hand it over if B doesn't agree.
Yes, but
it's like a bet.
That's my point.
I bet you that I won't rip my shirt at any point during this debate. I bet you $5 that I will not do that. Now, if I do indeed rip my shirt at some point, then yeah, I have to give you up $5. You know, I don't actually have any US dollars, so you know, joke's on you. But that doesn't mean that you suddenly have a part title in my shirt because I made a bet about it. It's I bet you that we will never disagree over how to use the stick. I bet you $5 that we won't. Right? That is all that's happening here.
You're making that person put stake in terms of, like, what would you say? So the right over the stick, in the same way that you could say that a contract can't be violated, because if you break the terms of the contract, it's justly I guess there's it just doesn't follow through, and there isn't any actual property stolen from an individual. But in the same way, if you establish a contract that, how would you put it? So the contract doesn't mean that I have a direct control over the stick if I'm person B. But it does mean that A has to, not implicitly, but conditionally, allow me to do that, and there are essentially there's consequences outside of the property for A if they don't follow it.
Sure.
Regarding to that specific property, and that's where I'm saying that there is a level of rights and control over the stick.
No.
You're able to control A.
Hold on. This might be an interesting analysis for an economist. Right, an economist might care that, you know, A has a stake to make sure that B can do what he wants up to a certain point. You know, if B's gonna, you know, try and like stick it up his ass or something, and A would really hate that, then it might be worth it for him to just give up the $5 bet and take the stick away. That might be interesting for an economist, but not for a jurist. The jurist doesn't give a damn about that, right? All the jurist cares about is, no, A doesn't have to let B do a single fucking thing with the stick. A could immediately say, all right, B could say, all right, now I'm going to stoke my fire with the stick. And A could just say, no, it's my stick. And then B would be like, oh, hey, you lost the bet, right? We disagreed over what to do with the stick. Give me back my $5, right? That's all that the jurist has to say about it, is who owns the stick at that point. A owns it the entire time. It's never the case that both A and B own the stick.
Let me think. Well, I guess you could say in a contrary system, rather than the $5, you just have B actually receives the stick under the condition that A breaches the contract rather than the $5 being related. Let's say A starts with the stick. B starts with $10 or $5 again, gives A the $5, and then A still owns the stick and $5, but under the condition that, let's say A doesn't allow B to control the stick, then B is the owner of the stick. That transfer occurs the other way.
Sure.
Then that would be a case where both of them have claims of ownership over the stick, because that means that the actions of A, in terms of not the actions of A, but B's right to the stick B's right to the stick is determined by A's allowance of, how would I put it? You get what I'm saying here. Essentially, if you create that structure where upon A denying B the right to the stick, or the right to control the stick under these contractual terms, the denying of that would relinquish his own ownership.
Okay.
That's a system where
this is more close to stalemate than it is to group property. But I can. It still doesn't have anything to do with group property. I can give you like a timeline of events. So at some point, A homesteads the stick, and then he owns it, and then they make this contract where the terms of the contract are they're first that B transfers to A $5, and that on the condition that there is ever disagreement over how the stick is to be used, then A transfers to B the stick, right? And then they go along happily for some amount of time. Then they have a disagreement over how the stick is to be used. And then at that moment, title of the stick is then belonging to B, and then B owns it from then on out. At no point do we have both A and B owning the stick. A owns it right up into the point that there's disagreement, and then B owns it. So there still isn't group property here. B wouldn't be allowed to, tell other people. I mean, the second A disagrees with B, then B gets that right. But that doesn't mean that B, does have that right already. He doesn't have that right until A disagrees.
It does, though, because that means that if you create that system, B can do whatever he wants with that stick. The second that A doesn't allow him to do something with that stick, it immediately becomes B's to begin with.
Yeah, so it's basically like B owns it. Right, so it's basically like B owns it at the second they make that contract. Is basically what's happening here. But that still doesn't mean
have the title to it.
That still doesn't mean that both of them. But okay, at which point in this timeline do you think both of them own it?
During from the second the contract is signed to the second the title transfers and the contract is completed. Because in that period of time, A has the title of the stick, but B has essentially the ability to control any action on the stick, no matter what it is. And the second that A disagrees with that action, or let's say it's not complete, let's say there's not a complete and explicit there's one conflict and then it's transferred, but you can then, built on that assumption, you can create terms that prevent conflicts from occurring, or you define conflict resolutions that maintain that concurrence and that state of, again, you said stalemate. That's what I would describe as collective ownership, where A has A really has a right to do whatever he wants, but at the same time, B, the second that contract is signed, has a right to do whatever he wants with the stick. And it's essentially like a logical and operator that you're placing upon the two individuals. And in that period of time, or that condition of the inputs is met, you have both of them effectively owning the stick. And that's where you get the group ownership.
So that still isn't group ownership in this interim period, because the condition of transfer hasn't been met yet, right? The condition for transferring from A to B is that they disagree on how to use the stick. Now, I would say this is a silly bet to make, but it's silliness doesn't really matter. The stick is owned by A right up until this point of disagreement, right? And it's not owned by B in that entire time. It only becomes owned by B when they disagree. At that point, whenever it might be, then B owns the stick from there on out. Not before it. Ever before it.
Well, no. We're talking about the title right now, and not just I guess not the colloquial term, but like essentially the more like informal form of term for ownership, which is, again, an exclusive right to control a piece of property and use it. In that sense, A and B both meet that description.
No.
I'm
I'm defining ownership as just the right to control something.
On titles.
So
yes.
In this interim period, A has the right to control it, B doesn't have the right to control it. The second B tries to control it without A's say-so, then B gains the right to control it. It's a weird scenario, I'll give you that, but it doesn't imply that B does have the right to control it.
Contradiction to A's sovereign or A's title. Hold on. That's a contradiction to A's ownership or control over the stick.
B only gains the right to control it when he actually tries to assert control over it. Right? It's almost like homesteading in a way.
That's a contradiction, though.
No. It's almost like homesteading in a way, where I don't have the right to control a branch off a tree until I start controlling it, until I get there and start ripping it off, right? Before then, I didn't have the right to control it, even though nobody else could have got in my way, right? I didn't have the right to control it. Same here
Well,
with this contract. Nobody
no.
can get it. Nobody can get in B's way and stop him from snatching the stick off of A. No, not even A can get in his way and do that, right? But that doesn't mean that he has the right to control it before he actually goes and snatches it away from A. It's like A has basically just said, all right, I am basically nature to you. You know, maybe they're playing some S&M game or whatever. I'm nature to you and you can snatch the stick off of me whenever you want. But that doesn't mean that they both have the right to control it in that interim period. B only owns it after title transfers to him.
But it does. So what you're describing is essentially abandoning his right to the title of that property, but only to an exclusive group, which is the
No. Only when the contract is complete. Only at the point where there's disagreement does that occur.
But as you're saying, once the contract is signed, you said that it's with respect to B, it's essentially a state of nature over that.
It's analogous. It's not exactly the same, right? It's analogous.
Him, it is.
So A is only
the second that he tries to use it in a way that is
A only gives up title. A only gives up title to the stick when that condition is met. It's an aleatory condition, right? So it could well be the case that they agree to this contract, they agree to this bet, and then A immediately, like, he's a wizard and he just like evaporates the stick in his hand. He's like, tee, it's like, B didn't have time to say I don't want you to do that with the stick. And it's like, what are you gonna do, right? So, or maybe he wipes his ass with the stick. It's like, B, do you disagree with this? Do you want the stick now? And B's like, nah, you keep it, bro. It's only at the point where that condition is met. That is when title transfers from A to B. Not before then, so B doesn't own it before then. B doesn't have the right to control it before then. Only afterwards.
But you're saying, again, that the title, not the ownership, is within the hands of B. You're making almost
ownership is a title
circular argument here. But what I'm defining ownership as is a more broad term, which is essentially the colloquial term as it's used, which is that there is an exclusive right to control property. And B does have that right. They might not have the title, but while A has that stick and the contract is in place, B does have an exclusive right to control the stick.
No. So
yes,
it's when I'm saying title to property, I'm saying the exact same thing as ownership. I'm saying ownership is a title to property, and a title to property is the right to control, and right control is the right to direct, and there are all these different synonyms you can use. It's all pointing at the same concept. B doesn't have the right to control that, just in the same way that I don't have the right to control a stick down. Just in the same way that I don't have a right, just in the same way that I don't have the right to control something that I homestead until I homestead it, even though nobody's standing in my way, right? And I'm going to be there first. B doesn't have the right to control the stick until he has a disagreement with A. Then he has the right to control the stick.
But even if they agree, then B still has the right to control it.
No, because they're agreeing. So A is the one directing it. He's like, yeah, B, go ahead. Right? Do what you want. Just as it's the same way where if I let my friend sleep on my couch, my friend doesn't suddenly homestead my couch. He doesn't own my couch because I'm letting him do that. I'm like, yeah, go ahead. I'm directing the use of the couch, not my friend.
But in the same, okay, you're almost assuming that A is directing the action, and Gree is only agreeing to it. What I'm saying is that in this situation, in that contractual situation, if B even decides to direct the ownership of the stick and A agrees, like that's an exercise where B is actually controlling the stick. He does not need to acquire permission from A, but B has to, the second that B initiates any action over the stick, he has a right to it. It doesn't matter. It's independent of A's desire. It's only determined.
If A gives it sanction, then A still owns the stick. I agree. I agree that B wouldn't have to bother A with any questions about what to do with the stick, right? Because for any given action, either A agrees that B can do it, or A doesn't agree, in which case B then owns the stick, right? So it's de facto, but not de jure ownership, is perhaps what we're getting at here. But I'm talking about de jure ownership. I'm talking about in the law. And in the law, you know, if we're applying this to the case of borders, it's definitely not the case that we have this weird situation with the public property and the hoppy and, you know, the libraries and whatnot. That, you know, suddenly, you know, we have this contract set up where it then transfers from A to B on the condition that A tries to stop B from doing something with it. Like, this is an edge case. I'll give you that. It's an edge case. It's an interesting scenario where you have de facto but not de jure ownership. But not de jure, it doesn't imply that group property is valid.
I would point out that it is de jure, because what that would imply is that it's taken to essentially an adjudicator. And the only reason that would happen in the first place is if there is a conflict, or if there is a conflict.
You don't need to go to adjudicators in law, right? Adjudicators are just there to apply the law.
That's the point, is that in the context of law, the only situations in which B would have there would be a legal question is when it's already in B's, the title is already belonging to B, if you get what I'm saying. Mm-hmm. In that situation, it is definitely de facto joint ownership between A and B.
No.
But even in...
Just because we agree on how... Because either it's the case that they agree on how it's used, or after it's been signed, right? Either it's the case that they agree on how to use it, or it's the case that B owns it. That doesn't imply group ownership, because you're saying when they agree, it must be de facto group ownership. But no, if I agree for my friend to sleep on my couch, that doesn't mean we both own the couch, right? I still own the couch. I have the right to direct it. Now, like, basically all you're pointing at here is that this is a retarded contract to make. And I agree, it's a retarded contract to make, but it doesn't mean group ownership.
That this is essentially the foundation of a form of joint or collective ownership. And again, you could literally make it so that there is no situation. Well, you could create a situation that resolves disputes as well, like conflicts within that, so that it stays in this state of limbo. Essentially, the point that I'm making about the collective ownership is just that it's possible within a libertarian framework to create a system where there is not a sovereign right of a title holder of a property to control their own property, and that you can create systems where there remains an exclusive right that the original title holder does not abandon fully. And that is essentially that allows for a realistic and practical application of collective ownership.
Well, no, because still here, I am just going to keep hammering this point in, that in the interim period, the contract as it's stated, as I got it written up here, is that A transfers to B the stick on the condition that there is disagreement. So until that condition is met, A still owns the stick. B doesn't own it until that condition is met. And like, I'm curious, because this whole thing started over my arguing against the restricted immigration types. How would we hope to apply this to the public library? Because there's definitely no contracts like this going on in the public. Even if you want to have like this, sort of going away from the precise legal theory into like, oh well, it's kind of like they own it all. How do we apply this to public libraries?
Well, this is just like, I guess, being a bit autistic, just to finish up the conversation on the collective ownership. You're correct in the sense that, the title is there to, that A has the title in that circumstance. But the point of a title, and the only time that a title is even used, is when there is a dispute over ownership. So that's kind of where I'm getting to with the point that the title is a completely irrelevant factor of the ownership. That the fact that A has the title is completely irrelevant unless, say, person C comes in and starts claiming the stick. In that case, A would say, no, it's actually mine. But the issue is that B, upon going and claiming that right, has a legitimate right to essentially just take the title from A the second there's a dispute. That's essentially what I'm making out. Like the situation that I'm making here is that there's still an exclusive right to that property, that the title to B is irrelevant. The fact that A holds the title in respect to B is a completely irrelevant fact, because the second that there's even a dispute over the use or the authority over the property, B has an immediate right to the title.
Right, and let's say even we were to take it that at the moment this contract is signed, even without the condition being met, we take the de facto into the de jure that B then becomes the owner. Well, that still doesn't have group property, right? It would still be, which I would say is the incorrect reading of this contract, but let's go with it. Even then, there are two readings. Either A owns it in the interim, or B owns it in the interim, because B can do whatever he wants with it, right? Whatever, that's fine. But that doesn't mean that both of them own it at any point, because then B is the one who has the right to say, the second they come to blows over anything, B gets to walk away with it. You know, this is sort of what's key here, is that you're fine with pointing out that title to property only matters when there's conflicts. Well, ownership in general only matters when there's conflict. The whole reason why we have this concept of ownership, and why we don't have it over like ideas, for instance, on Kinsella, is because you can have conflict. It only comes up because you can have conflicts. That's why we have ownership norms in the first place. So whichever way we want to go with this contract, that A owns it in the interim or B owns it in the interim, we still don't have it. That both of them own it.
But my point is that, I guess this is a different way to point this out. In that contract, the determining factor of the ownership is determined by the contract. And it essentially goes from a situation where if there is only one owner in your, in a very basic example, there's only one owner over the property. Here you're introducing a second person or owner of the property, and these decisions or this determining factor over the use of the property and these disputes is essentially just joined and channeled through the contract until you get one outcome. And because of that, because there is not, in the presence of a contract, there is not a definitive, independent, or I guess you could say there is not a universal determining factor of ownership that can be determined by one of the individuals alone, because it has to be a function of the two people's inputs, whether it's a dispute or not to begin with. Then you do not just have, the concept of ownership doesn't just retract to one individual.
So I want to just climb back up the flow here. The idea with this contract was that we were trying to get to some sort of contract which can yield group property. But that is
collective ownership, which is a different.
Well, collective ownership is the same thing as group property. I'm using the terms interchangeably. Okay. So that was the idea here. Not that we can get contract theory as being antecedent to property theory, because my understanding was we agreed that contract theory can't be antecedent to contract theory, right? Because that would involve the stolen concept fallacy, right? The idea is we need some contract which gives us group property. But I'm saying, okay, whichever way we slice this contract, whichever way you want to interpret it, that B owns it in the interim or A owns it in the interim, no way you slice this do both of them own it in the interim.
But my point is that I'm not saying that both do.
Saying we don't have a group property contract. right? But that was the initial idea. I'm asking, how do we resolve spearfishing or not? Well, we need a contract to do it. But then, what is the contract? Right? We need a contract which gives us group property. But this contract doesn't give us group property. So whilst it may be interesting, we need
collective ownership.
Okay, collective ownership. Then
there is a distinction, and here's what it is.
Okay, right.
If there is, I can put it up then, just real quick.
Okay, fine.
So my point is that when it comes to the ownership, it is not determined by one individual in this system where there's a contract. In any contract, there's not the ownership is not determined by one individual. It's determined by the contract. And the contract determines the ownership as a function of the decision that the two individuals or whatever number of parties in the contract are making on that property. And because that, you're essentially subordinating the ownership or the legal, not necessarily, well, yeah, so you could say the legal holder of the title is determined by the contract. And because of that, it's essentially like just the fact alone that from like in a de jure sense, where there's a stalemate or there's not an immediate or present sovereign over the property, then that is tantamount to exclusive control. The groups and the parties in the contract, unlike any other parties involved in the situation, have a claim, a conditional claim, not a sovereign claim. They have a conditional claim to ownership over that property. And because of that, because everyone in that contract has a conditional claim to the property, they are all conditionally owners that are deferring to the contract. And the contract, again, because that is what is being deferred to as to the rightful du jour owner, that is what determines that's what determines ownership rather than just an individual the second that a contract is made. And because of that, because you are deferring to the contract, like as long as that contract is in place, there is not a sovereign owner over the property at all.
All right. You're saying they're all conditionally owners, but there is one owner there, right? If I give you a loan, right? The example from earlier, I give you a loan. I am potentially an owner of $110 a year from now, but I'm not actually the owner of $110 a year from now until that condition is actually met. Sue's going to love this in chat. You're mixing up the potential with the actual here. I'm not yet the owner until that condition is met. Similarly, with any contract, yeah, I might become the owner if the conditions are met correctly, but I'm not yet the owner until those conditions are met. So on this, how do we get a contract which yields collective ownership? How do we, if collective ownership, you just mean, well, each person in this, defined in this contract, they might be, it may be a roulette wheel and each person is bet on each of the different numbers and the pot might go to any of them, but we don't know yet. Is that what you're meaning by collective ownership? Just that it might go to any one of them?
No, it's essentially that all the people in that contract have subordinated their control. Or I guess you could say even you could make the point that it's the collective ownership is a function of subordinate, like the present collective ownership is, maybe you could argue, du jour not possible, and that if there's only one title holder, then that person is the only rightful owner. But the fact that a contract places conditions not only upon the ownership, like right now, but on the the actual exercise of that ownership on the existing owner, they have subordinated their control over that property in a way that meaningfully, and like the de facto and like conceptual idea of ownership, which is just an exclusive right to control property, is in a capacity distributed among all the people involved in that contract. Like if I have a piece of property, let's say that going back to that absurd contract with the stick. If I am person A, I have to essentially, now that there's a contract, weigh my present ownership in all of my actions over the stick. I have to now subordinate, or I have to choose between present ownership and future ownership, which does not happen without the existence of a contract. Like that contradiction is essentially what I'm making. That if there is no such way for, for an unsubordinated sovereign ownership to occur, then that contract would essentially not be possible. But it is within the realm that we take contracts to be, serious and enforcing and de jure.
Right, okay. If I agree to pay a singer $100 to sing at my birthday party, and they show up and they sing, in the interim, there wasn't group property over that $100. It transfers from me to them when the condition is met. That isn't what I'm attacking when I'm talking about group property being a contradiction in terms. I'm talking about where we say, hey, this person owns it and this person owns it. No conditions attached. Just both of them own it. Right now, right here and now, not potentially if some condition is met. Both of them currently own it. Do you have any way to resolve that?
I just don't think that's like, I don't think that's like, what would you say? It's like almost a superfluous assumption that is even like, I wouldn't say feasible, but like that's a practical thing that would even be pursued. Well, like the fact that ownership is like essentially my point is that collective ownership by nature has to be conditional. Like it can't be the case, as you're saying, that two people have exclusive right to the property. It has to be subordinated to conditions, which can be done. And that's done by the contract. And within the contract, where there are multiple parties involved who have conditional rights to the property, they are owners. They're not title holders, but they do have a legal claim conditionally over that property that does not exist when only one person is an owner. Like that, even the title holder has to subordinate their control of the property to these conditions and to terms of the contract in order to maintain that control. And there's no other situation. The idea is that when there is an individual owner, they have complete sovereignty, or they have complete sovereignty or control does not coincide with the idea of like contracts such as that. Like if you have a sovereign control over this property, it's not a conditional sovereign control. It's a complete sovereign control from the second that I create the property to the second that I abandon it or die. And it's not an implicit abandonment wouldn't be legitimate. It has to be an explicitly I homestead this and then I physically abandon it. There isn't like, well, I mean, I own it unless I like do something that I want to do with it. Like the second you impose that limitation on the title holder's ownership, they're no longer a sovereign owner. And that contradiction that you're pointing out doesn't really even mean anything.
So to be clear, this contradiction I'm pointing out, the opponents of it aren't taking this stance that, well, you can potentially come to own something if certain conditions are met. People are legitimately, like a couple of streams ago, a guy from the Libertarian Christian Institute was coming out and telling me, no, the law of the excluded middle doesn't hold. We can both own it at the same time. Literally, in my sense of group property, multiple people can come to own something at the same time. You're making a different claim and not a claim that I'm attacking. And the Georgists do the same thing. They say, no, literally, everybody, the smart ones at least, literally everybody owns that which is natural. They literally own it in the group property sense. Not that they might come to own it under some circumstances. No, they literally already own it. All of them. And that's why it's an aggression to homestead. This is a stance held by many people, right? And
yeah, the Georgists are idiots, yeah.
That is what I'm attacking with my argument against group property. Is that the stance you're holding, or are you holding just a completely different stance? Because if you're holding a completely different stance, I'm not attacking you with the argument against group property. I'm specifically attacking when people say, no, multiple people own something at the exact same time. They both have the exclusive right to control it at that same time. They can both exclude others from doing it.
Well, no, it's a sovereign. I'm attacking right now, and what I'm attacking is essentially the notion that ownership implies or requires a sovereign right to control property, and that if that is not the case, if it is possible for conditional ownership to exist, then it is possible for group conditional ownership to exist. All right. Is essentially the point that I'm making.
But by conditional ownership, you're referring to potentials there. Now, I completely agree that other people can potentially, conditionally own property that is currently owned by you. I'm saying, just in actual fact, you currently own it until those conditions are met, right? If that's all you mean by... That
undermines your sovereignty to begin with, is the point that I'm making.
But I don't use the term sovereignty. Like, you're the one who brought that here. I don't use that in the derivation of my definition at all, right? If that's what you mean by non-sovereignty, then I agree with non-sovereignty, right? Because I think contracts are valid.
But here's the thing. If that's the case, then the point that you make, the contradiction you point out, doesn't hold, because that's something that only describes sovereignty.
I'm not talking.
If A has something and B, or if A and B collectively own, as we're, I guess, whatever that situation may be, if they both have ownership over this property, and then there is a conflict and only one of them gets their way, that's describing one of them having sovereignty over the property. That's all it's describing. It doesn't describe the ownership status of the other individual. You could create a system where, I don't know, every other conflict is to the victor goes, the victor flip-flops. If, A and B disagree, I don't know, 5 times, then A gets their way, B gets their way, A gets their way, B gets their way, A gets their way. And you don't necessarily, it doesn't necessarily mean to have collective ownership or to have group property that the second you lose your sovereignty, you also lose the property. And that's what your contradiction essentially that's what it essentially implies.
Right.
That is like,
again, all I'm attacking is the stance that at some given time, literally it is the case that multiple people own a thing. It's not that they actually own it. Not that, well, if certain conditions are met, somebody else might end up owning it, and there's this potential ownership dance going on. That isn't what I'm attacking with this argument. I'm specifically attacking, and this is perhaps more clear with the previous stuff in the course as context, but I'm specifically attacking the stance that it is the case that both A owns the thing and B owns the thing, not that if certain conditions are met, it might transfer from A to B, right? That's perfectly fine. And I go over this in the contract theory article. I'm confused about. It seems like you think I'm attacking the stance that you can have conditions on ownership, that ownership can change hands and stuff. I'm not attacking that. I'm attacking the stance that literally, actually, at this point in time, with no strings attached, multiple people own a thing. That is what I'm attacking. And that makes no sense. And you're saying, like, well, that seems superfluous and whatnot. Apparently it's not, because I've been getting attacked left, right, and center over this stance by people who are coming out and openly denying the law of the excluded middle, right? They will say, literally, it's the case that, both the wife and the husband are allowed to both paint and not paint the wall at the same time, and they'll just have to solve it through love or whatever, right? These are the types of responses I'm getting. Not that, well, it might be the case that it switches between the husband and wife if some conditions are met. That's all well and good. I'm fine with that. But that isn't what I mean by group property.
But there's essentially, again, in your point about the contradiction, that asserts that ownership and sovereignty are mutually dependent upon each other. Because if there is a case where, say, sovereignty is not fulfilled for both of the people, there is a conflict, it does not necessarily mean that the loser in that conflict loses their right to control the property and they lose their ownership consequently. That's essentially the point that I'm making. It's not necessary that the existence of conflict delegitimizes or negates someone's right to control property.
I'm not saying that the existence of conflict negates someone's right to control property. We get property theory from the fact that there can be conflicts. Yes. Right. I'm not sure there is disagreement here. Right? I'm not attacking that. I'm attacking the fact that it's literally actually the case that multiple people own a thing at the same time. Not sans any contracts, throw that out the window, it doesn't matter, right? Especially for the Georgists, right? There are no contracts about unhomesteaded nature. They think it's literally the case that everybody who has ever existed and will ever exist currently and actually owns everything there is out in nature, and that's the justification of the land value tax, right? That is where I developed this argument. That is what I'm attacking.
But again, like, I guess to tie this into something else, like shares, stocks, like a corporation, there's not if what you're asserting is the true definition of ownership, then like it implies that ownership necessarily has to be a sovereign right of an individual, and that it can't be a shared right of an individual. I completely agree with your point about like how that describes Georgism, but in terms of like you can have a situation. Essentially, what I'm saying is that the sovereignty of the ownership can be collectively owned if people subordinate their sovereignty. And they can do that to a contract. Like, for example, in the instance where there's like a husband and wife, they, let's say, own half of the property. And in that way that they own half of the property, they own a proportional share of the property. They have a proportional, essentially, like, right to control it and a proportional influence over these conflicts that could be determined by contracts and resolved by contracts. And that, like, systems like democracy, in a sense, where you have this collective ownership in the sense that it's a shared ownership, upon like agreed upon contractual terms, that is something that is consistent with libertarian ideas.
All right. Well, so democracy as consistent, like, as in literally rule by the majority.
Rule by majority when that is determined by the rightful owners, essentially. So like, I guess you could say like the Hoppian idea of like covenant communities is something that can still stand, and it can be governed by essentially a majority within the number of members of that community, and that's a legitimate exercise of ownership. It's just that the idea that ownership necessitates individual sovereignty over the property is not necessarily true.
All right. Okay. I can address some of these points, especially the corporations point, but I do need to go to the toilet real quick. Are we still wanting to talk about this? I can come back in a second.
Sounds good. All right.
Hello.
Hey, how's it going?
My bad. Yeah, sorry
All
about that. So
Yeah, no problem.
we have this sort of idea of, well, how do I deal with corporations, companies, stocks, and that sort of thing? I think this is perfectly legitimate under my system of no group property, because a company isn't a property right. There isn't a property right over a company. Nobody owns a company, right? You don't go out into nature and go to the company tree and pull a company off of it and then you own that company. All a company means is a web of contracts. So one way you could do it is, all of the actual trucks and everything, which we say is owned by Amazon, just have it owned by the CEO, just have it owned by Jeff Bezos. And the instant he does something which the shareholders don't like and they vote him out or whatever, then just have it transfer from Jeff Bezos, and he can agree to all this, to the next CEO in line, and then to the next one, and then to the next one. You have a whole line of succession throughout the whole company, right? That's perfectly legitimate. And you don't need multiple people owning a company for that to work.
I guess the point that I'm making is that that's not a sovereign ownership. The CEO doesn't have a sovereign ownership because of those contracts that are in place. Like your essentially assertion or your proof, your logical proof of how it can't work with A and B fighting over a stick. That the fact that disproves ownership would also disprove any form of conditional ownership. That's like a claim about the sovereignty of A and B being undermined. No. It doesn't. Like even
it wouldn't work.
Go ahead.
It wouldn't work in the under conditional ownership. Like let's because the initial assumption is that both A and B own the stick. If we don't have that initial assumption, then we can just throw it out. We can have the assumption A owns the stick, and then on the condition that there's a conflict, then B owns it, and then there's a conflict over the stick. Well, then clearly B owns it, so he should win, right? There is no contradiction anywhere in that chain, right? There's only the contradiction arises if we assume multiple people owning the stick. That's the only way we get this contradiction arising.
No, because again, essentially my point, which is that if you have a way to essentially resolve disputes through contract, then it's not necessarily the case that A, losing his sovereign authority over the stick has any implication on his ownership at all. Like you can have a system where the status of ownership does not change because of conflicts, and that there are built-in mechanisms within contracts to prevent those issues where sovereignty comes into question from happening, because there is not an individual sovereign owner of individual and sovereign owner of that piece of property. And in the same way that your case with the stocks, I agree that is the case. It's just I would not describe that as an owner, that the CEO is an owner, because they still don't have the sovereign right over that property. So essentially, if you have to jeopardize your future ownership, you have to subordinate your decisions to the possibility of losing your ownership, then you do not have what you are essentially describing as any ownership over that property.
Right.
Because there's a possibility where you will lose your sovereignty.
Right. So again, I'm not introducing this particle of sovereign anywhere into my analysis. I don't care what it is you mean by sovereign ownership. Okay, maybe he doesn't have sovereign ownership. Whatever. He still owns it. That's one way you could do it. I don't know if that's the specific structure that Amazon has set up. I doubt it. But that doesn't matter for the purposes of this. I'm saying that's one way you could do it. And if in that situation they did set it up that way, if they don't have what you're describing as sovereign ownership, they have some non-sovereign ownership. Okay, but they still have ownership, right? I'm not using the word sovereign anywhere in my analysis, so attack that all you want. I don't care, right? I'm saying they own it. One person actually does own it at any given time. It's never the case that two people actually own it. That somebody might potentially own it, but not actually, right? Multiple people can't actually own a thing, because that doesn't make any sense. Imagine wills, right? There's a patriarch of a family, he's got a son, and that son has a son, right? There's 3 generations here. And both of these 2 inheritors might end up owning the patriarch's fortune, but they won't actually own it until this one dies, and then this guy owns it. And then when this one dies, this one owns it, right? That fortune is passing down through the generations. That they have a potential claim to it doesn't mean that they have an actual claim to it. At any given time, one of the guys actually owns it, not all 3 of them.
But if it's I guess the point that I would make is that if you could split that fortune in half, then both of them would have, if you're talking about divisible things, then there is a possibility for distributed ownership, to distribute ownership, and that would maintain the property of sovereignty. But if you eliminate the necessity for that sovereignty, you can still distribute ownership without distributing the property. And in that case, you would say that, well, these 2 have, access to this wealth. Or I guess in just the instance of Amazon, the shareholders have a share of the ownership. They have a right to a certain portion. And in response to that, they would not have full ownership. No one would have full ownership, not even the CEO in that case, as you're describing ownership, because that ownership is always conditional in that sense upon whatever the terms of the contract may be. You could say that the owners of the shares have a direct claim to, say, 5 trucks worth of wealth within the company, and they have a claim to 5% of the the voting that goes down. But that decision-making apparatus doesn't necessarily have to be one person always has a sovereign and subordinated decision for ownership to maintain.
Let's say I have taken a stick out of nature. I've made literally 0 contracts with that stick. I've made no contracts with anybody else. Now, my ownership of that stick is surely still conditional on me not shooting it with my disintegration ray. Because the second I shoot it with my disintegration ray, the stick no longer exists, so I don't own it anymore, right? So would you say that all ownership is conditional in this way then?
You still own the materials of the stick. You still own the ash.
Let's say it's such a powerful disintegration ray. It literally destroys it right down to the level of energy, and that energy just immediately disperses across the whole universe. No way to ever collect it up again, right? It completely destroys the stick. No trace of it ever to be found ever again. It teleports into the past or something, back into the Big Bang, right? My ownership of that stick is conditional on me not shooting it with my disintegration ray. So it is all ownership then conditional on me not destroying my property and not abandoning my property.
Well, I guess what I'm saying would say that those are conditions. I mean, I guess in both cases of abandonment and, abandonment is a different story, because abandonment is actually it's not an exercise of sovereignty. You can't exercise sovereignty in a way that abandons it. I mean, it might sound contradictory, but if I am a sovereign over something, that is not something that is subordinated by time. Or even if I choose to abandon something and then I still have a sovereign claim, or I ever had a sovereign claim, the fact that I abandon it is not something that my sovereignty is subordinate to. So that's one, and then the other issue is just that's an impossibility that you're pointing out as a way to essentially highlight this.
Okay, so again, I do not care about sovereignty. Sovereignty, you could do a Control F of my course. I bet you $5 that sovereignty does not show up anywhere in that analysis, right? I don't care whether that means, maybe you can have group sovereignty, or, my proof against group property doesn't prove that sovereignty holds, or whatever else, right? Okay, I don't care about any of that. All I care about is that group property rights, A owns a stick, and B owns a stick, and C owns a stick, the same stick for all of them. That implies a contradiction. That is the only thesis I'm attacking here. That's all I'm doing. All right? So
but the point that I'm making is that that only contradicts your notion of ownership if it includes a component of sovereignty.
okay, what do you mean by
Because
sovereignty?
you can have I mean that the determination over what happens to the property is done by one individual. Like that's what you're building your argument off of. If there are three people and you decide that you're going to collectively own a piece of property by casting votes, and that the winning vote always gets, let's say, it always gets their way, and the losers don't get their way, and you've agreed to that, then there's no possible issue, or there's no possible conflict that can even arise, because you've come up with a method in the I guess again the contract for preventing these disputes from occurring. And the only way that the only way that ownership would be lost between a collective in that sense is if someone chooses to exit the agreement.
Okay, so
yeah, go ahead.
my theory of property, it doesn't care how you decide what to do with your property. You can vote on what to do with it with your friends. You can have some really complex algorithm which takes into account what everybody wants to do with it. Whatever it might be, that doesn't matter with the question of who owns it, right? The owner still fundamentally owns it, and the owner either agrees or disagrees to this decision, which the decision-making mechanism plops out, right? So if sovereignty just means that you don't have any sort of group decision-making process, then no, I disagree with sovereignty, and I don't rely on it for my property theory. But fundamentally still, it relies upon the property owner agreeing to this group decision-making process. And you can always disagree at any point down the line, right? That does not matter to property theory. He can disagree at any point and retain the right, you know?
But that's where I introduced that contract formation, where when he disagrees, he loses that right. That's
sure.
That was the point of me making that. If that is the case, and essentially for an individual to exercise their right over a piece of property, if they lose that right based on conditions, then your argument that in a situation with A and B over the stick, and there's a disagreement, only one of them gets their way. My point is that does not that only can that can only violate anyone's ownership if that is a form of what was I saying there? I lost my train of thought.
So the assumption that A and B both own a stick is not the assumption that A owns a stick and on certain conditions it transfers to B. That's a completely different thing, right? That is not the assumption I'm attacking. I'm attacking the assumption that in this moment, literally right now, both A and B own the stick. No strings attached. Who cares how they got into this situation? Doesn't matter. Yeah. Both of them own the stick. That is where we get the contradiction. Not when we have whatever decision-making mechanism which removes sovereignty. Don't care about that, right? Fine with that. However we get into this situation, it's saying literally right now, both A and B own it. Literally, not conditionally, not potentially. They actually currently own it, both of them. That is a contradiction.
Essentially, yeah. Well, what I would say is I think I get what you're saying. I think I get what you're pointing out. You essentially, if I'm getting this wrong, you're saying that, like, what in my essentially proposal, what you're creating is there's one essentially one title of ownership, and that title is divided among multiple people based on certain conditions. Essentially, it's a distribution of one ownership. And you're saying that two titles of ownership can't exist.
So, I'm saying it can't be the case that there is one property where multiple people have a title in that property, where A and B own this property. This is the exact same problem with fractional reserve banking. You have 80 units of gold in the vault and 100 units worth of certificates for gold, right? It doesn't work, because how do you resolve those conflicts there? Which, half the people who keep attacking me for saying group ownership makes no sense are completely fine with saying fractional reserve makes no sense, even though it's the same argument, basically. That is what I'm getting at. And so, yes, you can have...
I get what you're saying, yeah.
You can have these agreements that, okay, on this condition, then ownership transfers to these other people, whoever they may be, right? But you can't have it that A and B both, right now, currently, not conditionally, currently, actually, own a thing. That doesn't make sense.
Yeah, so like, again, essentially, what I would say is I agree with you. I agree with you in essence, but I disagree with you. I partially disagree with you. And I would say, like, I guess on the fractional reserve issue, what you're essentially saying is that there's 5 bars of gold and there's 100 claims of 1 bar of gold to those 5 bars of gold. Mm-hmm. And there's only 5 bars of gold, so that physically can't work. My point is that if there's 5 bars of gold and there's 100 people with claims over gold, that you could say, well, there's 5 bars of gold, and let's say there's 5 people who have, or 100 people that have 1/20th of a bar of gold that they claim. That can exist. Well, you don't essentially have to destroy or break down the 5 bars of gold for that to be consistent with public property. You could still say, well, I own 1/5 of a bar of gold, but the bar of gold is 1 bar of gold. And sure, we can still, the 5 people that own the other parts of that bar of gold can come to agreements on how that bar of gold is used in a collective way.
Sure, that's completely fine. But it's not that you're sort of aggregating here. That if I were to say, hey, everyone in America owns all the property in America, that's kind of, you're taking the resolution too far out here. It's, if we zoom in, it's actually the case that individuals own individual things, right? And you're doing this aggregation with the gold in the vault. It's actually the case that each individual owns individual slices of gold within these bars and whatnot. Not that the group of people who are depositors in this bank own the group of property within the vault, right? It's an aggregation issue, and you're losing resolution here, which, property theory has to account for the high resolution case as well.
Well, I guess, I agree. And I guess this is like a good place to get into the public property conversation, because I agree that I definitely agree with your point about, fractional reserve banking, essentially like that being like, I don't know what you're highlighting as and calling collective ownership. I would say that essentially, like, if we agree on the idea that it's possible for 5 people to manage parts of one, essentially the idea of shares of one, I guess, continuous entity that we call property. And there could be a way that they could break off from that, but there is a possibility for them to have a joint collective decision-making apparatus over one piece of property.
Yeah, and
that is in the immediate sense, it is continuous.
And to be crystal clear, just so we're not confused on this point in the future, I'm not meaning that all 5 of them collectively own the whole bar. It's that, you know, one of them would own one slice, the other one would own the next slice, and so on. And yeah, they could all come to agree, okay, we'll store it in this vault, we'll store it here. And then if they come to a disagreement, it's like, okay, take my slice out of it. And right, and then I'll take my slice somewhere else. Right? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. Yeah.
I'm completely fine with that. You know, this like distributed property, I think you called it. That is something I'm fine with. So I mean, if we agree on that stance, then I think we would agree on my argument against the invalidity of public property, because what the Dave Smithians are coming out and saying, I'm not going to call them Hoppians because they even disagree with Hoppe. I don't think Hoppe agrees with a lot of what they're saying. They're coming out and saying, well, you know, Dave Smith says he rejects the net taxpayer argument, but he hasn't clarified which argument he does agree with. Some group of people, you know, out there, they own collectively these public goods, but you know, it has to be for any given public good. Nobody owns it. One guy owns it, or a group owns it, and we've clarified that no, it can't be that a group owns it. So that option is out. If it's one guy, you know, that would be something like eminent domain, or where you can actually trace the titles back, and you go, hey, I've got the provenance here. I actually own this. Then that's fine. I'm completely fine with that. Every open borders guy I speak to, like Ace agrees with me here, that yeah, if you can actually say, hey, no, I owned that thing, and they took it off me, then yeah, go ahead. But it's for this third category where you can't find anybody around who has any title to it. Then it's prima facie unowned. You can go ahead and homestead it.
Yeah. So I'm just gonna, like, I guess, preface this. Like, I feel like if we were in a state of complete libertarian society, we would have a complete agreement over, you know, in terms of property rights, how society would function. Like I like agree with Hoppe's like idea of, I mean, like covenant communities as a form of creating government, and like the ability to essentially form, I guess you could say, club goods rather than public goods, which would be an example of that distributed ownership. But the second you get into public property, the issue is not that it is, in my opinion, that it's a collectively owned, you know, form of property, but that it's stolen. And that essentially, to form public property, you know, absent, we're gonna, I guess, to separate public property, you could separate the like public lands from the, like, I guess, like a public park or like a public building. One of them is like in you know, realistic terms, people would have a right to homestead that, and the other is essentially stolen property that's been reshaped into buildings or whatever. And the distinction that I would make is that I think you and people like Ace would point out or call the public property unowned, and I would make a very like important distinction, which is that under the state it is unownable, in the sense that they enforce that I guess you could say they enforce public property in a way that prevents people from homesteading or prevents people from reclaiming the property that was either in the original sense, it was either unowned or it was owned by someone else. So because of that distinction, we have to treat it differently than just it's all the same thing.
Right. I agree that the state prevents people from reclaiming and homesteading this property. And that is, the open border stance is that they shouldn't be doing this. That they should allow people to go ahead and go, hey, no, I have title to that because it was eminent domain and I want that back, right? Yeah, go ahead, take it back, right? And if there is no title to owned by anybody, right, then go ahead and say, hey, I want to homestead that public highway or something through fucking New Mexico desert. I want to take that. Go ahead, right? That is the open border stance applied consistently. You know, obviously the mainstream open borderers, they just want people to be able to cross over and they don't really care about the point of homesteading. But
the ownership,
we libertarians understand that the real crux of the issue is on these public goods, these forestalled goods by the state. And my stance is they should stop forestalling it. Let people come in, homestead it, let all the ownership quabbles be worked out, and where there isn't an owner to be found, let it be homesteaded by some business or whatever, and let that business make productive use of it. That is my stance. That is the open border stance in its most consistent and distilled form.
So how would I say this? I agree with that position as it relates to exclusively, again, the property that has never been owned, the property that has never been homesteaded or undeveloped. But when it comes to the property that has clearly essentially been created by not just the the state forestalling the property, but they have actually built upon it using tax dollars, and they have essentially created services like busing, public roads, public parks, public schools, public whatever. That's a different story that needs to be managed differently than just saying, well, we're going to throw up our hands and say, it's a free for all, everyone can homestead everything, because, essentially the argument that I would make on how to deal with that is, I guess, in a libertarian sense, if the state ended tomorrow and we had the option to just clear the table and, in state libertarianism, I would say that the property that is unowned should, again, be open borders, like you were saying, but then the property that has been transformed through tax dollars should be essentially redistributed to the tax holders in a way that is like offered shares for the dollars that were contributed. Like if you are, a massive taxpayer in a small city, and basically all of your tax money went into building a park, you would be the owner of the park.
Okay, so
essentially the claim that I'm making is that rather than saying that all of public property should be in the instance that the state is abandoned, that all the public property should also be abandoned, it almost negates the fact that they were created by theft. It almost negates the principle of, I guess, just restitution.
All right, so this is another point that Ace makes. I think he might have been the first to make it. I don't know. I learned about it from him. Which is, there isn't a chain of title transfer which links taxpayer Joe to the random public school, right? The fundamental question is, well, when did Joe become the owner of that public school? And does Joe own that public school? Like, who owns the public school? Is it a group of people? Can you figure out which slice of the public school Joe owns as against anybody else? Like, that's entirely unclear to me. It seems like we're just regressing into group property here, where all the taxpayers own this school, and how do you untangle that mess of things, right? And when we have Joe has $5 stolen from him by the state, and then the state pays a contractor with that $5, that $5 is still owned by Joe. Wherever it goes throughout the economy, Joe still owns that $5, right? Joe doesn't own the things that were used to pay for things with that $5 because those contracts are all invalid. It has to revert back where, the state wasn't allowed to pay for those things because they didn't own it. Because contracts are a transfer of title to property, and the title was never transferred away from Joe, right? Theft doesn't transfer title of anything, no matter what happens after the fact, right? When did Joe become the owner of the school?
So what I would say is, if that's the manner that, you would handle issues of theft, which is essentially, rather than focusing on essentially restitution and focusing on dealing with the criminal in this case, that you're following the property and the ignoring all of the transfers of title that are done with that property. So the opposition that I would have with that is, firstly, if that is the way of resolving thefts, to follow that in a way that complies with the non-aggression principle, you would necessarily need to essentially capture the criminal in the first place. If, let's say A has $5, it's stolen from A by B, and then B takes that and buys a coffee. Well, I have no idea where he bought that coffee from. I have no idea who that C is that has the actual dollar in hand. For me to find that person, I would have to first go get B. And let's say even if I did know C and I did know that he had the $5, I would need evidence that that $5 belongs to me, and that the title transfer that was made in the context of B and C is invalid in the first place. And to do that, I would essentially need to acquire the receipt and the property of B as a prerequisite for me to actually go after C, if you get where I'm coming from.
I mean, all you're kind of pointing at is, yeah, it's going to be, I would say at this point, impossible for anybody to untangle the mess of nonsense that the state has foisted upon us. Indeed, it's going to be impossible to trace every last penny of tax I've ever paid, trace where it's gone throughout the entire economy. But restitution isn't always possible. Legal theory doesn't guarantee. It's not a magical spell which says restitution will always be possible. All restitution means in the case of theft is that you get your property which was stolen back to you, right? If I steal a painting from you and I give it to a dirty bum in exchange for a cigarette, you still own the painting. You don't own the cigarette. The bum still owns the cigarette, because that contract was invalid, because I didn't actually own the painting, right? So the bum still owns the cigarette. You still own the painting. Now, if, fucking God was looking over this and he came down from the clouds and said, hear ye, I can tell you who owns everything. I can tell you that bum owns this cigarette and, you own this painting, then we can untangle it all, right? But that we can't always do this. It's just a comment on the fact that, man's not omniscient. That doesn't have any bearing on property theory.
But here's what I would say. In the context, let's say, as another example, as how this likely would actually play out, if, what is his name? Rupert Murdoch, the guy that defrauded all those people. Let's say he, willingly acquired all this cash from all these investors and all these people.
I mean, Bernie Madoff.
And then, Bernie Madoff, sorry.
Rupert Murdoch's a newspaper tycoon.
Yeah. I got them confused. They're both on fucking New York City doing shady shit. But
the New York financier, Jeff Epstein.
Yeah. So, anyways, Bernie Madoff. Let's say he took all these people's money, put it into a common pool, and they essentially had their money taken from him under the assumption that he would, say, invest it properly. Well, they didn't necessarily transfer their title for that money. How would I put it? The money that he used fraudulently in order to exchange stocks or whatever, disregarding the fact that it was just a Ponzi scheme and that it actually, wasn't like a distribution. let's say, for example, that someone just invested in the wrong company, like a broker invested in the wrong company with someone's money, and that was like an illegitimate use of that money, but it still exists in a relatively consistent value that was not condoned by the rightful owner, and it was only misused by someone in possession of it, then, the concept that the what would you say, the original owner, the original investor into this broker should not get the stocks that were misallocated or misacquired is like it's ridiculous to say that in the instance of theft, where theft can be proven, that we can't go about simply restoring essentially the nearest comparable value or nearest comparable amount of property to the original owner, the rightful owner. And I guess a good example of this is filing for bankruptcy. Like if you file for bankruptcy, like people will make you have to sell off your house and sell off your business or whatever, or sell off your assets in order to repay loans and things like that you had a legal obligation to do or whatever. And in the process of that, it's not like you are reclaiming the very dollar bills that you received in the loan. You're requiring abstract dollar bills that are fungible and giving them, because they have value, to the person that was essentially robbed via fraud, or it's not necessarily fraud, because it is bankruptcy and the loans aren't it's not a form of fraud, but it's a contractual whatever. The terminology I'm not using isn't accurate, but the point is that I'm trying to make is essentially that it's not necessarily the case that because there is not a valid transfer of title to justify the original owner of stolen property, to have the property that it was exchanged with. The fact that it is invalid is only determined after the fact that the person, the thief, was captured. So from the perspective of person C, it's really only that's only an invalid contract if their rights are imposed upon by, say, A coming after them for their original money. If that doesn't happen, then that contract is still valid. If A is going to settle with that cigarette, or settle with the money instead of the stocks instead of the money, or in this case that we're eventually getting to, that the taxpayers will settle for a share of the public goods instead of their direct tax dollars that they spent to get for the state to create them, then that's all consistent with an idea of validating or resolving thefts.
So all you're pointing at there is that when I steal this painting from you and then go trade it, yes, I am indeed stealing from the person I'm trading with. I'm defrauding them. Fraud means theft by deception. I'm stealing that cigarette from them. I am, because they still own that cigarette and I'm taking it away from them. I've deceived them into thinking that I actually own it. So with you brought up the case of bankruptcy where we're forcing people to sell things off. I think that's completely illegitimate because it's an alliatory contract. You can't have this situation where you can't repay your loans. If you can't repay your loans, then the fucking loan sharks have to suck it the fuck up.
Yeah.
Right. Too bad. Right. The loan went bad. That happens. Right. Invest in better people next time. But with this Bernie Madoff case, what would you say is the correct principle of redistributing these assets to different people? If it's not that we go after, and try and deal with, okay, well, let's return the assets back to their actual owners and then let's get the money back to these people. If that isn't the principle you're working on, then what is the principle that we use to redistribute these, if we're assuming then that, well, those contracts were all valid, and we're going to redistribute this from Bernie to his victims? How do we go about doing that? Like, what do we use? Do we go like, who has stolen the most from gets like the Lamborghini, even if the Lamborghini might not be worth much? You know, value subjective on Austrianism. Like, maybe the guy who was stolen the most from, he just really likes money but not Lamborghinis. Like, how do we deal with this?
Well, I guess the point that I'm making is that so from A to B, I mean, from the money going from A to B is theft, and that is an illegitimate transfer. And B does not own that money. B is not the rightful owner of it, but he certainly possesses it. And when B transfers or exchanges with C, unless C is like a fence, like he's an official, like that's his job to just buy stolen property, then within the context of that contract, then that was a legitimate contract from the perspective of C.
Yeah, because he was defrauded.
The only time that, well, no, the point, I guess, even in your course where you describe contracts, you say that contracts can only be enforced if the person being, who's being, it can only be enforced if someone is a direct victim and their property, the property that they own or is in their possession, is essentially, taken away from them. So my point is that within that context, that's a valid contract from the perspective of C, even if it was, if he received illegitimately possessed property, unless A decides not to just go after B and the property that B has in their possession, which is, again, also illegitimate, but because in the situation where A goes after B and takes B's property that they received from C, and let's say both legs of that contract, we consider them to be legitimate, and both of those people possess each other's property, then if that is the case, the only time that or I guess you could say the only time that contract itself would become illegitimate is if A, with B's I guess evidence of purchase and the property, goes and says, hey A, or hey C, like that was an illegitimate transfer that you made, and the property you possess right now is mine. Unless that happens, then A can't go after C, even if it was illegitimate. They can go after B's property, and the property that is like rightfully C's, but it's like that contract between B and C is only invalidated if the property that C possesses, which is rightfully A's, is actually taken from him to begin with.
I reject that premise. The contract was invalid right from the word go. The second that B tried to make a trade with C using stolen goods, he's defrauding C there. He doesn't actually have title to it, and the contract would say, hey, I'm transferring title of this in exchange for that. That doesn't work because he can't transfer title of this. He can't do that, so it's fraud. He's stealing what he has from C. So that contract was already illegitimate. So C owns whatever is that B walked off with, not what he got from him. So A is perfectly fine to go to C and say, hey, I own that. I can prove it. Here's a picture with me on vacation. Here's all the details. Here's B stealing it from me. I've got all the proof here. I'm taking that now. And if you try and stop me, I'm going to shoot you in the face, right? That's perfectly legitimate on the part of A, right? He can do that. And then it's, C's job to try and go after B. That's what should be happening here. The people who should be going after Bernie Madoff are the people who get defrauded by, the stockbrokers or whatever. That's who should be going after Bernie Madoff. And, the people who paid into his Ponzi, if we're assuming that this is all illegitimate, I don't know about the specifics of the case, but we can assume that it's illegitimate what he was doing. They should be going after the stockbrokers who got the money, right? That's who they should be going after, not Bernie himself. The stockbroker should be going after Bernie. This is how it should be happening. And if we
I don't agree with that.
If we don't have this, let's take FTX, right? Sam Bankman-Fried bought up like a bunch of like sports cars and whatnot, and they're going after sports cars and his luxury estates and whatnot. But how do you determine through what principle of redistribution are you using here? Are you giving it to, like, how are you deciding who owns his like Lamborghini? How do you decide that?
Well, you would evaluate, or you would, you would do evaluation of all the assets, and then you would distribute that, or even you would liquidate them, and then you would redistribute it in essentially proportion of who was stolen from. Like if you have like $1 million, there were 5 people who, took or who were stolen from in different proportions. You'd pay out those same proportions with whatever you can essentially reclaim and liquidate from the thief. And that's the only, I guess, essentially where you're pointing out that the contract between B and C is illegitimate. My point isn't that that's wrong. My point is that for A to actually be able to enforce that, he needs evidence. And in the case of tax dollars, there is not evidence. It's not like there's any sort of any sort of connection between the individual dollars that are used or that are given to the government and the individual dollars that the government uses to the contractors. It's like it's a complete abstraction where right now, if that was the principle in place, like every dollar in every individual's pockets would be considered stolen. It's been, even if you just consider inflation and monetary policy as theft, it's like every single dollar is abstractly stolen that we have. So the only like logical way to deal with that theft, and even again, to prove that contract is illegitimate and C has A's property, you first have to go and determine essentially what the contract was from B. And if that is the case, then you would already be in a position to take B's property away from them. So it's like this thing where whether A should go after B or C is actually it's almost a function of what A wants in that case. And in the case of, like, again, tax dollars or public property, it makes a lot more sense, again, because of the abstractions of these long chains of transfers that would be impossible to track down. It makes a lot more sense that A would settle with the public property and just getting a redistributed or liquid share of that public property, instead of, in the case of, some bum getting a piece of art in exchange for a cigarette, you might be going after that bum. It's something that's determined by A, because A is the one who's, again, A is the owner of the property, so they have the right to, B didn't have a right to make the contract in the first place because they didn't own the property that C received. But it's almost something where, A can let it slide if it's an agreed upon term.
Well, A could let the whole thing slide if he wants to, but if he doesn't want to let it slide, his property is out there somewhere, right? And he's got to go and find his property. He doesn't have a claim on what isn't his property. Like, so you were saying we liquidate the assets. So like Sam Bankman-Fried's Lamborghini, we liquidate them. Okay, well, what that means is you're selling it to somebody, and then you're taking the cash and you're distributing it amongst the proles, right? Whatever. But how do you determine what the best price for that Lamborghini is? How do you determine what price that Lamborghini should be sold for? And
market.
Lamborghinis are sold for different prices in different areas and whatnot. Like maybe it should be sold for $1 million, or maybe $1,000,001, or maybe $1,000,002. Like how are you determining this price? Who is deciding what the price should be? Who's deciding what a good deal is?
Well, I mean, if you want to go again, like the answer to that is fairly obvious when you have a system of, like, in the public property sense, or even in that sense where the exchange was made for, dollars essentially in the first place to begin with. for, assets. And if that's the case, then the obvious solution is to essentially portion that out, even without a need to liquidate those assets.
Well, hold on.
Portion them out.
If you want to portion out the dollars, though, if your solution is
out the assets in relation to the dollars that were spent to create them and maintain them.
But what if nobody spent the exact amount on FTT tokens that Sam Bankman-Fried spent on his Lamborghini? What if that is the case, right? Because that could happen. So how do you determine how much you should sell that Lamborghini for? What do we do with the Lamborghini?
Well, then you would, if there is not a complete, again, then you get into this idea of distributed ownership, where you could have multiple, essentially, owners that would then, from that point, decide, are we going to liquidate this?
Like, so everybody who is stolen from by Sam Bankman-Fried has to decide, okay, this is a good price for it. Or maybe we'll just all drive it on different days.
Well, no, again, this is getting into sort of a... Well, so let me get into, I guess, like from here, that we've almost agreed that this is something that's possible, and it's just it's almost an issue of feasibility or the mechanics of it. So we could get into the actual property idea, like the public property, idea of what this would look like. So in the situation that we have now, the probably most direct way of handling the public property is to say, well, the public property, let's say this public park, or let's say there's a municipality, all the public property in that municipality, we issue shares for essentially either access to a club good, and we just say that the public property is collectively a club good, or we could say that I don't know, that it's distributed a little bit more between individual assets. But if we go to this issue of club goods, you would then have a distributed property system, like a company, where the property collectively would be managed through some form of privately conducted, contract. And then from this, you could even say, people are going to sell their sovereignty or their citizenship or their membership of this club good of local public property, in this case, to someone else who wants to have a say or access to these institutions. Or you could even do something where, that share is proportional to a physical piece of property, where that might be the street in front of your house and like a chair at a library, and you could just say, okay, I'm going to just sell these things off, or I'm going to take actual possession of these two things and turn them into private property instead of a club good. Essentially, that's how that would be managed, and then all of the unowned lands that are being forestalled would just be forestalled. But the idea that essentially we have to abandon or treat the public property as abandoned is completely inconsistent with the notion of just the notion of restitution and non-aggression principle. And even if you were to make the case that you need to abandon the property, then that would mean, and not just abandon the property, but abandon the property and stop pursuing the thief, then that would mean that the state also has a claim to that very property that was essentially stolen and abstracted away from the tax dollars.
Okay, so your solution to the Sam Bankman-Fried Lamborghini paradox is that all of the victims get shares in the Lamborghini.
if the Lamborghini is the only thing, yes. If there's a Lamborghini and a bunch of cash, they get a share of the cash and a share of the Lamborghini.
Sure, but just in the Lamborghini, we'll just focus in on the Lamborghini. Who owns the Lamborghini at that point?
Again, that would be something that would be determined by, in this case, the way that this would work is a court essentially, or some sort of adjudicator would rule and essentially do the breaking up and distribution of these properties based on like a civil or criminal case.
Okay.
And like after that, they would whatever that court decides or the collective decides is that's how that would be handled.
Okay, on what principle would this judge be acting upon in distributing these different assets, the Lamborghini and whatnot? What rational rule could he be using and applying here to determine who owns the Lamborghini?
Well, it would just be a proportional concept. It would just be that the Lamborghini was, bought with these funds. And again, let's say we have an exact title transfer to the person C who sold them the Lamborghini. Again, you could find out if you want to like get into the more difficult case. You could go in and actually trace down all those dollars and see, who has the exact share of the Lamborghini. Or you can just say, what is the proportion of theft? Like that's just it's like the intermediate step that is assumed without going through the hassle of and the costs of seeking out the property to begin with. And again, the whole point is that this is something that is determined by the victims if they want to go about this course of action or not. And likely, I mean, I guess this is where I would point it out. We're assuming in this case, and we have to assume that the property that was acquired with the stolen tax money, or the stolen money in general, is still maintaining its value. It's still maintaining its actual original value in some sense.
All right. Okay. So I in that, like, what is the upshot of that for the judge? Let's say I'm a judge and I've just been given the FTX case in front of me and I'm trying to apportion these assets. We're assuming that for some reason, everything Sam Bankman-Fried was then owned by Sam Bankman-Fried, and then we're giving it to his victims. How do I determine? I'm looking at the Lamborghini in front of me. How do I determine who owns that Lamborghini? What norm am I applying here to look through the list of people to figure out who owns the Lamborghini? Because it's no longer, well, it was stolen from this money was stolen from this guy and then used to buy this asset, right? It's no longer that. It's now who owns the asset, right? Who owns that asset?
So here's like the most obvious solution to this, and probably the that would transfer to the public property case, is that the judge would just liquidate it. They would find a potential buyer. They'd have an auction or something like that. They would sell it off and then take the assets that they received and then portion this out, which can be much more easily done. And in the case of just public property, that's just the process of privatization, where these goods would just be transferred into the hands of someone else in exchange for a pile of cash. And that cash would be given to the taxpayers in proportion to, whatever was taken in order to, create and maintain that property. And there would be some loss, there'd be some depreciation, but that requires, like, I guess this could get into like the bordertarians, the bordertarian position where we do actually need the government to, in the meantime, while the government exists, we do need it to actually maintain the value, the function, and certain like basic operations, and like just it just has to maintain the property that it possesses that it does not rightfully own. In the meantime, or that's something that we would prefer. And I guess an analogous position is like if a hijacker took control of the cockpit of a plane and was flying it around, the owners of the plane, or the rightful owners of the plane, or the captain and everyone on board should be like, hey, don't crash the plane, land it. And even if that requires them to actually, use and not be laissez-faire with the plane, then it's within the interest of the taxpayers, all of them, or the passengers and owners of the plane, that they maintain the status of the plane and the condition of the plane, and actually, land it so that it can be properly distributed and essentially properly dealt with at a later date.
So you said there that the principle that the judge should be operating upon is that he liquidates it. Well, let's say I'm the judge and I say, you know what we should do? We should liquidate it into possession of the judge for $5, and we'll give those $5 out to the victims. Okay, right, I agree to this. Me, the judge, and me, the judge, we both agree to this trade. I give $5 and I'll decide which victims. And by the way, maybe I gave a penny to FTX back in the day, and you know what, who should get this $5? The judge should get this $5, and then the judge gets the Lambo and the $5. Is that legitimate?
Well, no. I mean, that's what I was saying about they should put it up to an auction would be the market value is the best option.
But what is the correct, how much is enough to sell this Lambo for?
Well, that's not something that's determined in the market. That's whatever the highest bidder or the highest person. Again, you put this on the. Okay,
let's say I do a literal silent auction where I don't even announce that the auction is happening, and me, the judge, I am the only one who knows it's happening. It's going to happen over 5 seconds within my bedroom, and when I start that stopwatch, I say I bid $5. Oh, time's up. I win the auction, I guess. So there was an auction over it, but nobody else is invited.
Business immediately. I mean, just like
okay, but would that be legitimate? Would it be legitimate if he did that? Like, maybe he doesn't care if he goes out of business, because he's going to have all of Sam Bankman-Fried's assets at the end of the day after he does a bunch of 5-second auctions in his bedroom. Would that be legitimate?
Well, it wouldn't be legitimate, not because it's I guess what you would say is that it's just absurd. Like, it's not.
I agree, it's absurd. And this is what happens when we have the judge just decides to liquidate it, right?
Well, when the judge gets to decide. That's a matter of the legal system. That's not an incrimination of the way to deal with.
But would it be illegitimate for the judge to do this? Because you think that this is the way that we should be dealing with these restitution situations, not tracking down the actual owners of these goods, but just the judge decides to liquidate it. And then the judge can decide how to liquidate it and who to give it to and all this different stuff.
I guess the point is, like, if you go into this, or no. Okay, so then let's say we skip that and we just go back to the shares. The judge is probably a bad idea. Let's say that there is a liquidation, or not a liquidation, there is a theft resolution, and the judge allocates shares of all the assets to the people that were stolen from in the proportion that they were stolen. Those people then, who it would be within their interest, could then get together and create, let's say, a democratic way of dealing with it, which would likely lead to them auctioning it off in the market.
All right, but who owns the Lambo?
it would be you could do something where you have a company and divide it into shares. You issue a.
But who owns it? Like, a company isn't a person. A company can't own things. Somebody has to own it.
Again, this is where I would disagree with you on that. This is where we get to that the idea of I mean, yeah, again, like a company, you said, is a group of contracts.
Hmm?
So if that is the case, there might be an executive, which might be the largest share of owners, but
there could be not. Who determines that?
Well, again, that's the point that I'm making, is that the judge would create forms of contracts that would allow this.
So then the judge says, I'll give one share to myself, and I'll be the executive.
Although that's not how adjudication works.
Well,
that's not how.
Would it be illegitimate if he did that? Right? I'm trying to get at the base principle.
Well,
even if we don't have any judges on earth, there's still such a thing as law. Right? The judges are just trying to apply law, is what I'm trying to get at here. Right? So there has to be, our property theory has to assign an actual owner in these cases. My system does that perfectly well. Whoever the guy fraudulently got the Lambo from still owns the Lambo. That's who owns the Lambo. And that money should be going back to the original people. That is my system. So I actually know who owns the Lambo. But you don't know who owns the Lambo. That's my point.
Well, I did point out who owns it. Your point is that there needs to be essentially a sovereign executive, but there could be created a system that you could create between those joint owners, a system or a contract that establishes.
But would they all have to agree to the contract?
Well, at the cost of their, they would have to come to an agreement, or essentially.
What if they don't? What if I'm the final holdout and I say, I'm actually me, right? And I say, no, I don't think this is a legitimate system at all. I will not agree to any. I will not agree to any sort of system of shares over the Lambo. I will not agree to anything. Okay. It's my way or the highway. I want to own that Lambo, right?
Sorry.
What do we do with that situation? Who owns the Lambo?
Okay. So in your system of dealing with theft, again, this completely, it almost ignores the fact that it takes money and resources to reclaim the property, the stolen property, to have a judge adjudicate what's done with it, to do all of these processes. It takes resources. So if one holdout over the Lambo is like, hey, I don't agree with this, I think I would rather have the stuff that the guy that sold him the Lambo has. I'd rather track that guy down. Well, then it would be on him, who's not willing to settle with the shares of the Lambo, to put up the cash that's needed to pursue the guy that took the Lambo and acquire the cash from that guy. That's the point that I'm making. You could have a situation.
But what if instead of that,
you could?
What if instead of going after C in this case, right? What if instead I just say, no, all I'll agree to, the only system I'll agree to, is where I get exclusive control of the Lambo. And, everybody else is rolling their eyes. They're saying, let's just do shares, bro. Let's just do shares. And I'm like, no, I want the Lambo, right? I'm just a baby. I'm just kicking my feet and stomping my hands, right? I'm just saying, I want the Lambo. I just keep chanting this at the back of the hall, right? How do we deal with this?
All the other subjects of theft, they would say, okay, if we're not going to get anything from this situation, then we will go and pursue the person who has the title to the Lambo.
Okay, so
then that's the point that I'm making, that case is likely not going to happen if there is this massive dispersion of the actual properly owned wealth that was the victims originally. And if that is not something that can be decided, then that's what will be pursued. But in the interim, it is necessary to acquire the property of the thief that was used in that illegitimate transfer, for essentially forestalling it from B, or not forestalling it from B, taking it from B and giving A the option of coming to an agreement on whether they want to just settle with this, or they want to go after their original titles. And chances are, from an economic perspective, that they are going to settle with the property that was in B's possession.
Let's say, I'm doing the stomping, I want the Lambo. And then they all leave the hall. Okay, fine, we'll go after original property. And then I run up to the front of the hall and they park the Lambo there and I drive off in it. Would that be legitimate for me to do? Because I wanted the Lambo. I made the decision that I wanted to go after, B's assets, right? Would that be fine?
No.
But hold on. I thought it was the choice of A if they wanted to go after B's assets.
Because there's no contract in place over B's assets relating to the people that were stolen, that A stole from. So until that contract is formed between all of the people that have in the interim a claim over it, then you can't just have one person assert that, oh, well, I'm actually the sole owner of it, because there are people within that claimed group, within the group of A, that are going after C. And because they're going after C, they are deeming the contract between B and C legitimate. That was until that point not asserted to be illegitimate. They are asserting that it was. So because that contract was illegitimate, it does actually return to C.
Okay.
Until A asserts, or a portion of A asserts that their property, they would prefer to go after their original property rather than the property that was reclaimed from the thief, then that contract is legitimate and it's better to just adjudicate the property as is.
Okay, let's what is this contract actually defining, right? So we're agreeing on a shareholder contract. What does that actually mean? Because a contract means a set of transfers of title to property. Who is it transferring from, and who is it transferring to, right? From whom to whom?
Well, it's not from whom and to whom, because essentially A is the rightful owner if they do not negate the everyone in A is a rightful owner if with a proportional share. Again, if you could see the title transfer, you'd be able to determine this very easily. You'd be able to essentially break the shares, and based on the portion that was spent to and given to B. Like, that's something that you would be able to easily determine. And I mean, that's the principle that the judge would be basing this off of, and people would be accepting. And then from there, the ownership would just be formed via contract and joint ownership, and it would just be they would bang out the agreement through the court system, whatever that may be, to say, okay, well, this is what Group A is going to do with the Lambo, and it's up to them. If they're going to have a system, and maybe there's only 2 people robbed or like 5 people robbed, and they're like, well, we're all just going to use it and share it or whatever. I never had a Lambo before. I'll drive it on Fridays. Like, that's something that they can do, but it's something that is up to them to decide once they get to that point where they have agreed to the property that they collectively own as a group. Or not collectively own, but they all own in some proportion.
All right, but that's not a contract. If you can't tell me who it's from and who it's to, then you don't have a contract, right? Because you can't just have it that
A to A, or from C to A.
Whoa! But C never agreed to. First of all, you can't have to A because A is in this case a group, so you can't have to A. That doesn't make any sense. And second, C never agreed to transfer that Lambo to A, right?
And stockbrokers are intermediaries too. When the people selling stocks to a stockbroker are doing so, the stockbroker doesn't own the money that he's paying. He's simply possessing it for the purpose of that transfer. That does not illegitimize the fact that
What's the relevance of that? Like, do you disagree with the premise that C never agreed to transfer to A?
No, or I do disagree with that. Yes, because the point
C never even knew about A. So how could C agree to transfer to someone he doesn't even know about?
If you're selling a stock to a stockbroker, you never know whose money you're actually receiving. There's an intermediary that you don't need to actually.
Hold on, but this is talking about a Lamborghini,
representative,
right? So the Lamborghini dealer was sitting there in his office, and then Sam Bankman-Fried walks in and he says, "I want that one. It's red, right?" And he buys the Lamborghini. He pulls out his big bag with a money sign on it, and he drops it down on the desk. I assume that's how these deals are done, you know. C agreed to transfer to Sam Bankman-Fried in that case. He agreed to transfer to Sam B. Fried in that case. He never agreed to transfer, and then a bunch of these people come to the door and they're like, well, you transferred it to us, by the way. It's like, no, I never agreed to that. I agreed to transfer to that guy who's running out the back now, right? That's who he agreed to transfer it to, not this group of people. So do you disagree with that he never agreed to transfer it to these people he doesn't even know about?
Well, I'm going to say that whether or not, if that is not the case, if C is actually brought into the question, the point is that the contract's been made illegitimate, and you're deferring to that previous follow the money strategy. And to begin with, the reason of me bringing up the contract is saying that, well, we might get this market value of the Lambo might be at the time $400,000, and that's what you get for it. But let's say B spent $500,000 on it. Well, then if B spent $500,000 on it, and 5 people were robbed, and they each got robbed by an amount of like $100,000, then you would say, oh well, we could liquidate this vehicle, and we know who's essentially cash was used to purchase it, but we know the proportion. That's the thing that I'm getting to, or I was bringing that up to mention.
All right. Well, anyway, it seems we're going in somewhat circles here, and it's getting kind of late. So I think we can kind of cap it off there. Yeah, thank you for coming on. You have anything
talk?
You have like a channel or anything you want to talk about?
Just the Twitter, I guess. Go on and follow just Noah Fredericks, capital N, capital F on Twitter or X or whatever. But yeah, so it seems like we, generally speaking, were able to come to, some, I guess, agreements about what's legitimate, what's not legitimate there. I don't think we really got to the main point of the actual, whether border is justified or a state, while it exists and isn't, enforcing a border or enforcing policy over public property is legitimate, or not legitimate, but preferable to abandoning it. But, short of that, I think it was a pretty productive conversation.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you for coming on. I guess I'll see you later.
Yeah.
Yep. Hey, boop.